So what has the last 96 hours been like for both of you?
Listening to the internal Democratic Party debate in this moment has been just so, there's just been kind of like a whiplash going on of, should he come out? Should he not come out? It's just been kind of a lot to keep track of, and it's still evolving.
I feel like it's all I've been thinking about. But Tyler, you have actually been with Biden for the last 4 days.
Been living it.
So what's remarkable about my experience inside Biden's bubble, I was one of the few reporters who was with them the entire time, is that they acted as if nothing went wrong. The Democratic Party ecosystem is melting down. People are privately and publicly calling for Biden to step aside or at least question whether he should. And inside the bubble, it's business as normal. One of the top aides to the First Lady was dancing at 2 a.m. on the tarmac to Diana Ross as the president was greeting supporters in Raleigh, North Carolina after the debate.
That is so interesting. Welcome to the Campaign Moment on this Tuesday, July 2nd. I'm Martine Powers, co-host of Post Reports.
And I'm Aaron Blake, senior politics reporter and author of the Campaign Moment newsletter. We're also joined this week by Tyler Pager, White House reporter for The Post. Hey, Tyler.
Hey.
So today, we are going to spend all of our time on one big, messy topic, which is the fallout from Joe Biden's performance at the first presidential debate, and all of the questions that performance raises about the future of his candidacy. So we're going to get an inside look into Biden world from Tyler and understand how this has played out from inside the president's circle.
We're also going to take a step back and look at how voters are reacting and whether the debate could be a game-changing moment in the 2024 campaign.
So, Tyler, I want to come back to where we just left off, which was these hours that you spent with Biden after the debate. I want to hear more about what people inside his circle are doing and saying, but I also just want to hear about the president himself, because Biden is someone that you spend a lot of time with up close. And I think people's surprise and in some cases dismay at his performance was a reflection of this feeling of, is this what Biden is like when you're just talking with him? It brings up these questions about what does his day-to-day look like? And so I'm curious if you can give me a sense from your perspective of the Biden that we saw on Thursday night. Is that the Biden that you see when you are with him and reporting on him?
It's a great question. And I think to take a step back, it's important to recognize how little we see Biden unscripted. Even for someone like me that has traveled around the country and around the world with him since he launched his campaign for presidency in 2019. We were in the midst of COVID. There was a bubble that has persisted even as we've come out of COVID. There are very few opportunities to engage with the president in unscripted, informal settings. He's not somebody that is meeting with reporters off the record, doing regular press conferences. His appearances are often short and very scripted. He's always speaking on a teleprompter. He'll sometimes have a back and forth with reporters on the tarmac as he's getting off or on Air Force One or as he's leaving or entering an event. But that sort of setting where we saw the president last Thursday is something we see very rarely. Now, that being said, that was one of the worst performances I've ever seen of the president. And I've been covering him, as I said, since 2019, every single day.
So even you were surprised?
Yes, even I was surprised. Now, what's important to note is that the president has long had difficulties with public speaking and public performance.
His long history of having a stutter issue, which I think has resurrected itself a little bit more in his more recent years.
Absolutely.
I was really struck by your story this week on Biden's debate prep and kind of how little that the things that we saw on the stage reflected what was being planned for behind closed doors at Camp David over a week. And specifically, there was an anecdote in there about Biden having prepared for a direct question about his age and then giving just a very different answer from the one they'd been talking about over the past week. Can you just talk about that debate prep and how it's being received by those who were involved in the prep and were aware of it?
Yeah, so the debate prep now is the focus of all the scrutiny as people try to look back to figure out what went wrong.
And specifically, who to blame.
Right. I think everyone's looking to blame somebody. And based on my reporting, Biden himself knows that he did not do a good job, and he is not casting about, blaming other people and his aides. He is very loyal. And so when you look back at that debate prep, the conversations I've had with people was they left feeling confident. And I know they were telling anxious allies, just wait for the debate. The president is going to perform well. He's going to dispel any notion that he's not able and up for the job. When you talk to people, that doesn't mean he blew it out of the park in debate prep. He wasn't a different person. He still struggled communicating, finishing his sentences at times. He wasn't going to win any debate competitions based on his prep, but they thought that he would do a satisfactory job. And if you look back at the topics and the questions, none of them were wholly surprising. They spent more than a week preparing. They had worked through all of the topics that were brought up: the economy, reproductive rights, immigration, age, January 6th and democracy. All of those topics had been among the things that Biden prepared for.
So what happened?
I think that's the question that no one is really able to answer. Some people say they gave him too many facts and details, and he was trying in his answers to, hit a script and make sure he included all these facts and figures that he was prepared with, and that, he got bogged down in that. Some people say that he knew the first answer did not go well and then sort of got in his own head and was unable to recover quick enough, and it took him a little while. But I don't think anyone would say, honestly, that they thought he had a wonderful debate.
So regardless of what the reason was why his performance was so poor, it was bad enough that what resulted was the great Democratic freakout of people from kind of all levels of the Democratic Party asking very frank questions about, should this person be our nominee? Like, is it too late to switch to someone else? Like, how have we seen Biden and his camp responding to that pressure?
Roundly reject it, not even entertaining the idea that he would drop out of the race or not run for president. And I think what's important to understand is to get inside the psyche of Joe Biden and his aides. They feel that they have always been underestimated, that the president himself has always been counted out, and the pundits and the press and the bedwetters, as they call them, have always said Joe Biden can't do this. And I think that's a really important thing to understand as we think about the conversations that are going on inside Biden's orbit right now. Even if you go back to 2019, 2020, when he came in fourth in the Iowa caucuses and fifth in the New Hampshire primary, there was a whole round of the former vice president at the time, Joe Biden, needs to get out of the race. He has lost both these states. Embarrassing margins. He has no path forward. He needs to save his political career and just gracefully exit the race. He obviously didn't do that. He went on to finish second in Nevada, win South Carolina, and win the nomination and defeat Donald Trump. And they've always felt that Joe Biden has not been the darling of the media class or the pundits. He's middle class, from Scranton, didn't attend an Ivy League college, and that's a really important part of Joe Biden's psyche.
This sense of innate defiance.
Exactly. The chip on the shoulder that I've proved you wrong before and you've never believed in me and I've won. And so I know what's best. But I also think, Martine, it's important to realize that these concerns about his age are not new. If you've looked at polling over the last year, the majority of Democratic voters said they did not want Joe Biden to be their nominee. They thought he was too old to do the job.
Well, and that's my question now. And Aaron, I am hoping that you have insights on this. In terms of how we've seen people actually react to this debate, whether they watched the debate in its entirety, whether they watched the worst moments on social media, to what extent are we seeing a change in the poll numbers in the days after, as a reflection directly of these worst moments of Biden's performance?
I think it's safe to say that this has been a negative for him. I think one of the challenges here for the Democratic Party moving forward is that this race has proven so stagnant before through many major developments. We're a very polarized country, and the idea that we're going to see huge shifts on the head-to-head ballot, the idea that Biden's suddenly going to be trailing by 10 points, maybe that happens, but it would be out of character for the American people to shift that much, even after an event this significant. But we do see in those surveys the concerns that already existed are being magnified to some degree. There was a CBS YouGov poll that was released over the weekend that showed the percentage of Americans who said that Biden had the cognitive abilities to serve as president, dropping from 35% last month to 27%. 4 in 10 Democrats said that he's not up to the job of being president. 40 to 45% of Democrats think that he should drop out. 7 in 10 Americans say that he shouldn't be running. His favorable rating in CNN polls after the debate dropped by 6 points, while Trump's rose. So we're not going to see necessarily a huge shift, but we are seeing these kind of pre-existing liabilities that Biden has, including, as Tyler mentioned, this age thing, which has been an issue for a very long time, no matter how much people try to look past it. It's really just kind of cementing some of these liabilities that were already there and maybe bringing them to the attention of voters who are a little bit more casual before.
And two really important points, Aaron, that you just made as we look forward is, one, Biden was trailing Trump before this debate in most polls, and in aggregates of national and battleground polls, Biden was behind.
And this was supposed to turn it all around.
Exactly. So the campaign was hoping that this was the moment that the campaign was hoping Americans would see these two men on stage and decide they could not return to 4 years of Trump. And they wanted this debate to sort of turbocharge their campaign and energy. That obviously didn't happen. But two, to Aaron's point about the polarization in our country, I think if we're going to start to see a movement about people publicly calling for Biden to step aside, that being prominent Democrats, elected officials, which we have not seen yet, I think one of the catalyzing factors for that will be some really bad polls that show Biden bringing down House candidates, Senate candidates, gubernatorial candidates. And as Aaron said, the race is so close and people are so stuck in their partisan ways that it might be more difficult for us to see a poll that has Biden down 7 or 10 points. And that might be the factor that's necessary to get a real push for people to call for Biden to step aside, despite what we're hearing in private on background from top Democrats. They might not have the information publicly available to really make the convincing case that Biden needs to step aside or that another Democratic candidate would perform better against Trump.
Okay, I want to unpack for a second what you just said there, because I find that really interesting. So what you're saying is that it's not just about poll numbers saying people are losing even more favor to Biden and that like things are not going in his direction, but that the pressure point might be other candidates, other Democrats who they need to win the House, win the Senate. If they were to go to Biden and be like, look, you are dragging me down. Like, I think that my race is going to suffer because your race is suffering, that might be more persuasive.
Yeah, I mean, politicians are nothing if not self-interested and above all want to prioritize their own political survival.
Yeah, and we've seen a kind of remarkable divide in the Democratic Party right now. The people who are calling for Biden to step aside are almost exclusively Democratic pundits who in some cases are former lawmakers, liberal commentators, newspaper editorial boards, some kind of graybeards in the party who aren't in office right now. But the official Democratic Party has been much more reluctant to go there. And so it's going to be really interesting to see. There's a real tension here because, as I mentioned, merely having this conversation hurts Biden. It presupposes that he's not up to being a candidate and possibly not up to being the president.
I would just add, I've heard that from people inside Biden's orbit too, in the White House and in the campaign, saying we are ignoring this at our own peril. There is clear anxiety and panic in the party, and we need to do something about it.
Democrats have been reluctant to go down the road of potentially replacing Biden, but we did see, especially on Tuesday, some signs that the dam could potentially be breaking. We saw former Congressman Tim Ryan and former Housing Secretary Julian Castro, who served in the Obama administration, talking about the need for an alternative. And then we also saw Jim Clyburn, a high-ranking member of the House, say that he would support Kamala Harris if they needed an alternative. And then finally, we saw, perhaps most significantly, a member of the House, an actual member of the House, Congressman Lloyd Doggett of Texas, call for an alternative. So I think all of that reflects that Democrats, a lot of them at least, seem to think that maybe something needs to be done. It's not fun to say that, but we've seen in the past how not saying it can lead to very bad things for the party.
I've heard the term thrown around a few times the last few days, Ruth Bader Biden, kind of acknowledgement
I hadn't heard that one.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who didn't step down at an opportunity that Democrats thought would have been advantageous.
Yeah, that's a case in point right there.
I think people blame her for Roe v. Wade being overturned, and that this might be what is in store for Biden. It's the fear, right?
And just to bring it all back, I remember I was on the plane with Biden in 2020 when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, and shocked and saddened. And it's just such a indelible image in my mind of this elderly politician running for president back then in his late 70s. And now to see him potentially being compared to her as that figure, I think we have heard people to that point talk about Democrats don't learn their lessons.
Okay, so we're going to take a quick break here. And then when we come back, we're going to take a look back at how Biden secured this nomination in the first place. And at this point, I think, still fair to say, long shot possibility that he might step aside. We'll be right back. So what I found really interesting about this moment and these questions that are being asked by the Democratic Party in this late stage of the campaign, like, is it too late to find another candidate to run against Trump? And who would that person be? Is like, there is actually a process for considering other candidates for the party, and that's called a primary, and we had one, but there were no other candidates who came forward. And I think it's kind of instructive to just go back briefly and understand, like, why over the past year and a half have we not seen anyone other than Dean Phillips come forward and try to challenge Biden? Or why was there not more of an open conversation about, well, what would it look like if the party did have a different candidate?
Biden wanted to run, and the way that major political parties work is to protect incumbents. And Biden is the incumbent president. So I think that's the key starting point here, is that Biden and his aides decided that he wanted to run. This is a person who's wanted to be president his entire life, has run for it for decades, largely unsuccessfully until his late 70s. And he felt he was doing a good job. The Democrats largely won the midterms.
Yeah, I feel like the timing becomes really important, too, that his announcement came right after the midterms.
Absolutely. So he actually didn't announce for many months until after the midterms. The midterms was November, and then he didn't announce till April. But the party was moving in a way to ensure that there was no opportunity for people to run. And there was chatter about this problem going back. I mean, Dean Phillips, the congressman from Minnesota, obviously he ran very unsuccessfully, never caught much traction. But he said he had called top governors and said, you need to get in this race. And there were conversations about people who wanted to run and thought Biden should step aside. And I also
who?
I'm not sure that I can reveal all the conversations of people who wanted to run, but if you look at the category of people that are plotting runs in 2028, governors of big Democratic states, all of those people would have been interested in running in 2024 if Biden did not run. Obviously, there was...
So we're talking Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, Gavin Newsom of California,
Pritzker of Illinois. Those are some of the more established governors. Then there were governors that won in the 2022 midterms, Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, Wes Moore of Maryland. Even Bernie Sanders' allies were not ruling out a run for him if Biden decided not to run. And of course, Vice President Kamala Harris would have eagerly stepped forward to run. I don't think she would have cleared the field. I think there would have been a competitive primary.
Tyler mentioned the 2022 midterms. You know, winning cures all ills, and it also helps you overlook flaws. You know, every time a candidate wins, there's a lot of punditry that's like, well, they did everything right. And every time a candidate loses, the punditry is like, oh, look at all the disastrous things they did, even when sometimes it's a close election. You know, the 2022 midterm was an historically good election for the president's party. They gained only a little bit in certain areas, but generally speaking, the president's party loses significant ground in these midterms. And they've also had good special elections. They had good elections in the 2023 off-year elections. And so I think a lot of that foreclosed a real conversation about what should be done moving forward. Winning kind of cures all ills, even as they had these polls staring them in the face where Biden's age was a significant concern for the American people.
And one thing, Aaron, just to I think underscore here is when you talk to Democrats, Joe Biden took credit for winning in the midterms, but Democrats would say he's not the reason they won. The reason they won was largely because the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. And Democrats use that as a huge messaging opportunity to say that they stood with the majority of Americans who polls show did not want Roe to be overturned.
So this is like being, in their view, like
100%.
misattributed to the strength of Biden as a candidate.
Right. Well, Biden used it as an opportunity to say, look, the American people are happy with the direction that I'm leading this country, and they want me to continue to lead them. But if you talk to Democrats, if you looked at the campaigns, Biden was not at the core of these campaigns. Some candidates were even running away from Biden because inflation was a huge concern. I mean, it remains a concern, but really in the midterms, that was a huge thing. And all of these factors sort of congealed into a way where it tamped down on any sort of dissent. And when people did speak up, they were roundly slapped down by Biden's aides.
Tyler brings up something that I think is really important here. We mentioned a little while ago, whether we'd see candidates who are on the ballot with Biden start to raise more concerns because they worry about being dragged down. A lot of these candidates, almost without fail in these Senate races, are running better than Joe Biden is right now. If you look at the swing states like Nevada, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, these are all states in which the Democratic Senate candidates look better than Biden does right now, often by a significant margin. And I think what that could tell Democrats, if they're looking at it closely, is that the American people and the people in these most crucial states are prepared to vote for Democrats. They're showing that in these Senate races. But they're not prepared to vote for Joe Biden.
Mm-hmm. I want to come back to one thing that Tyler mentioned a little earlier in talking about this kind of constellation of potential other Democrats who would be excited and game to step in if Biden does step out of the race. Obviously, Vice President Harris is one of them. And not only is she one of them, she, I think in the views of a lot of Democratic operatives, presents a problem because she is both not popular. Polls have shown that her popularity hardly beats Biden, if it even does. And at the same time, she is the first Black female vice president, and the idea that she would be passed over to be considered as president.
As Joe Biden might know, as former vice president to Barack Obama.
Yeah, exactly. That would be, the fear is that would be alienating specifically to Black voters, Black women voters, this idea that she was passed over. And how could that sort of like divide up the party in a critical moment where you needed unity behind one candidate? I have questions about whether that's actually how things would play out, whether I think is an oversimplification of how Black women think, to be like, they would be offended and then they would just like give up and not vote for whoever ended up being the nominee. But yeah, I'm curious to hear you guys unpack a little bit more the Harris question and like why that has become so important in this moment.
I also think the Harris question is an important consideration when you look back at Joe Biden's decision to run. I think people in his orbit did not think that she would defeat Donald Trump. And so if he stepped aside, he may feel the pressure to endorse her, and then she would lose to Trump. So I think it's also not just a present and current question, but also looking into the past as we think about why Joe Biden decided to run. Above all, he wanted to run, but I also think that is part of that conversation. I think as we look to potential replacement options should Joe Biden step aside, which, as we've discussed, is very unlikely, I think it's a huge question. And the way that the process would work at a convention where there's this, the delegates would have to nominate somebody else, she has the most name ID. She is the one that has been on the world stage, on the national stage, right next to Joe Biden. But I think people would be worried that she would not be able to win. And so maybe one of the ways to inject enthusiasm and excitement is to bring someone else into the fold. But I think some of this conversation is just so difficult to have because there's no signs that Biden is interested to stepping aside. And at this point, if he does not release his delegates, if he does not step aside, none of the bedwetting or the anxiety or the wish casting, people are like, I would love it to be Gretchen Whitmer and Raphael Warnock, or Gavin Newsom's our savior, or J.B. Pritzker. Democrats love to play this game of like, if we lived in a utopia and we could make these decisions, this is what I would love it to be. But there's a process for those things to happen, and it just seems unlikely that any of this will.
Yeah, and that process would get messy even irrespective of the Kamala Harris question. Imagine thousands of people, thousands of delegates gathering at the Democratic convention in August in Chicago and sorting this out just among themselves. Like, this is not voters who are voting. This is a small portion of the party. This is party activists. All of them may have very different ideas about who that would be, even if we get beyond Kamala Harris.
This
and
feels
it could
like the
lead to
chaos
some very
of the Iowa primary or the Iowa caucus, like times
but
10,000 with a much higher
the thing that
stakes.
also I think people are overlooking is that there's this quirk in the process this year.
Yeah, so that quirk is that Ohio had a law where the presidential nominees had to be picked at least 90 days before the election. And so that deadline is actually before the August Democratic National Convention. But let's just explain a little bit about how delegates work very quickly.
In order for there to be a new nominee, Biden has to step aside. And if Biden were to step aside, then the 4,000 plus delegates to the Democratic National Committee would be able to vote for a different nominee, is my understanding. Now, there's a lot of complications around exactly how that plays out. But essentially, the reason why people think of a fight on the floor is because the way that a roll call vote traditionally works is they go state by state and the state announces are 60 delegates for Joe Biden and 1 delegate for this person. And then it sort of adds up. And that's what we saw in 2016 when Hillary and Bernie were sort of fighting on the floor. And so if there were not a clear nominee, basically the way that it works is delegates are tied to who won the state's primary. So it's allocated that way. So when Biden wins 80% of the Michigan primary and 10% of uncommitted, those 80% of the however many delegates come from Michigan are assigned to Biden. If there's no Biden to vote for anymore, then they can, I think, vote for whoever they want.
Right. So that's why the Ohio thing is important. The roll call is now scheduled to happen virtually before the convention is.
This idea that there's going to be a fight on the floor of the convention is never going to happen because it's all going to be settled formally and legally before we even get to Chicago for the convention. And I think that's sort of lost in the mix here, that it's never going to play out that way because they had to move up the nominating process because of Ohio. And that has gotten a lot more scrutiny in recent days as people talk about replacing Joe Biden, is that it's all going to happen very quickly and virtually. What was initially the result of this Ohio quirk, but is now in Biden's favor because there's less time to sort of open up this process.
Yeah. So in this world where the status quo is what the race is for the next few months, Biden doesn't even entertain stepping down. What is his strategy from here? And Tyler, what is the sense that you're getting from inside Biden's circle of what they're trying to message to Americans who saw this debate and were shocked and maybe horrified?
The thing is, there's a lot of denial in the Biden camp about how bad this performance was. If you look at the memos and you look at the words that they are speaking, they are saying this debate did not fundamentally change the contours of the race. So they say the media, the pundits, the editorial boards are blowing this out of proportion, and it was not his best night, but it didn't fundamentally change the fact that it's still a very close race. It was always going to be a close race.
We heard a little flavor of that in an ad that they just put out a couple days ago. Let's listen to now.
I know I'm not a young man, but I know how to do this job. I know right from wrong. I know how to tell the truth. And I know, like millions of Americans know, when you get knocked down, you get back up.
And so they will also point to that rally. That clip is from a rally he did the morning after the debate in Raleigh, North Carolina. And I was at that rally, as we've discussed. I was with Joe Biden for a very long time in many states over the course of 3 days. But that rally was unlike anything I've seen before. As the Democratic Party is melting down and people are saying he should get out the race, we show up to this boisterous rally with more than 2,000 people. And the conversations I had with voters were, some said he did fine. Some said it wasn't his best night, still better than Trump. And it was a remarkable scene to be in. The split screen of what you're seeing on cable news and what you're seeing on Twitter and what you're experiencing in this rally. And the most striking thing about it was that was one of the biggest rallies he's had his entire campaign. I've been to many events with him. He's usually in very small, controlled environments. And this was like a rock concert. And Joe Biden is not the type of candidate that draws those crowds. And so the campaign is also pointing to events like that and saying he did great there. People loved him. The thing that they're not really squaring is a lot fewer people watched that rally than the 50 million people that tuned into the CNN debate.
Yeah, and I mean, I was personally struck, like, hearing the audio from that rally, like, how much stronger his voice sounded and how much more confident he was on a stage. And obviously, like, a stage with a crowd and a teleprompter is different than being in a debate. But it's like one of those moments where it's like, well, where was this guy the night before? But still, so, like, given that they're trying to downplay the significance of the debate and the effect that it'll have on voters. What do they do for the next 4 months? Do they just pretend like the age thing isn't a problem and they just carry forth with, I'm better than Trump, and that's all you need to pay attention to?
Do they put him out more? I know that is a topic of conversation. There's people I've spoken to in the White House and the campaign that think they need to do something to address this. I think the question is Biden up for the challenge? Is he going to be able to go out and give a performance that quiets the critics or renews them?
I think that they need, and they probably recognize this now, they need to get him out there more if they can. There was I think a really instructive conversation on Monday between Jake Tapper, who was one of the CNN debate moderators, and Chris Coons, who's a very loyal Biden ally, senator from Delaware, his home state, basically saying, look, you know that you need to put him out there. He should do a 2-hour press conference, Tapper said, and dispel any notion that this was the real Biden that voters saw on Thursday night. We've seen, Biden increase his schedule in the days since then, but it's really going to come down to how he performs in moments that aren't scripted, when he's not on the teleprompter. He needs to prove to people that that was an aberration, and you can't do that unless you're out there.
All right, well, we're going to have to leave it there. Listen, guys, really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation during this critical, wild moment. Tyler, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And Aaron, thank you, and see you next week.
Thank you, and don't forget to subscribe to the Campaign Moment newsletter, everyone.
And you can find the link to the Campaign Moment newsletter in our show notes and at postreports.com. Of course, Tyler Pager is a White House reporter for The Post, and Aaron Blake is a senior political reporter. If you're tuning in via Post Reports, we will keep bringing you these conversations at least once a week, but you'll also be able to hear more from Aaron and our other colleagues by following the Campaign Moment show feed itself. That is where we'll be dropping extra episodes as campaign news picks up even more. Be sure to look that up wherever you're listening. Today's episode was produced by Laura Benshoff with additional production help from Ali Bianco. It was mixed by Sean Carter and edited by Allison Michaels and Mary Jo Murphy. I'm Martine Powers. See you tomorrow.
When you use words and you're a political journalist, sometimes you have to make sure that they mean what you think they do. And I actually looked up bedwetter in the Political Dictionary, which is a website that I would recommend that people look at. Bedwetting in politics.
I love that you have a political dictionary. I don't even know what that is, but that's hilarious.
No, it's not my political dictionary. It's somebody else's.
Okay.
The bedwetting comes from the psychological world. It refers to a child's fear of loss of control in the night, and it is generally used to refer to some kind of an overreaction that comes with losing control of the political landscape.
I think the fear of loss of control in the night is a pretty good encapsulation of Democrats.